I work at Christian Family Solutions. We have over 100 counselors in many states throughout the country, and at this moment in the history of the world, we have them via telehealth all over. So we are grateful to be able to provide Christian counseling, not only as we used to do in offices, but now especially this has propelled us forward in some of the work we were doing in telehealth and now at a larger level. So I'm happy to talk on that if need be. I was asked to kind of stick to a little bit of strategies and survival tactics and some things that we could do, especially as families during this COVID crisis. So that's what we're going to talk about today. You will see a Q&A feature on your screen. You can go ahead and click on that little bubble and type in any questions that you would have. I'm going to keep moving along, and then we're going to just put all the questions together at the end and sort of take those together. So Christiana and Christine are going to look at that for me, organize that, and then we'll come back. So feel free, as you're thinking of questions, to go ahead and type them in that Q&A, and we'll take care of those right at the end. All right. I love psychoeducation, we call it, or education around mental wellness. And so I'm just glad to be able to offer it in this fashion. But normally I am more of a facilitator. So I've learned a little bit about webinars, and I'm hoping that it will be useful the way that it is. I'm usually not a lecturer, but hopefully it's things that you can use and that are practical tools you can take home and use today. So essentially, we've got three basic things that I think are popping up in especially the clients that we're seeing in our outpatient practice and in our programs and groups. I spend time in just individual counseling, and then also in what we call intensive outpatient groups. So people who are really looking for more structure than just maybe once a week. At this time, we're picking up the pace with those types of groups. And then also, so I do an adult group, and then I also work with a teen group. And what we're seeing essentially are three basic things that I wanted to share with you tonight. Number one is this is a crisis, and we're going to talk about what I mean by that, what a crisis used to be and what it is now. Are they the same or different? And then basic ways that we respond when crisis comes. So I think that will be helpful. The second thing we're seeing a lot of is difficulty with people across all age spans regulating how they feel or what their emotions are in response to the things that are happening. And it's not just COVID itself or the virus itself, it's all these other pieces that are kind of woven together. And how do I manage emotions, whether it's for myself or a child in my home? And then probably the third thing that we're noticing a lot is folks, all kinds of them, going through all sorts of different grief. Grief just meaning the loss of something or someone important. And, clearly we think of people who have lost friends or relatives. We were just talking about that to the virus itself. So grief, loss of someone you love, but also there's a lot of other things that people are grieving. And children are doing that too. So I want to talk a little bit about the grief process and what's happening there. When we talk about it from a Christian standpoint, we also want to bear in mind what's the foundation of counseling and what's behind any of the things that we're working on, the skills or strategies we're working on. And I chose this section of scripture, Ephesians 5:21, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. This passage comes right before the section in Ephesians that sets up the Christian household. So Christian marriage, Christian family, talks about, at that point, relation with servants and others. But how is it that we're supposed to get along? How is it that we're supposed to engage one another and live together? And it's not out of selfish ambition or gain for myself. It's not even really about love for the other person. It's about reverence for Christ. And how else would we be able to do that if we weren't doing it for a God who loves us unconditionally? So I want you to keep that lens in mind as we look at some of these skills, some of the ways that we can work on crisis. All right, well, on March 12th, I was working on work-life balance, and a lot of people were. We had everything kind of in its spot, and we knew kind of how to get along and balance everything. Some of us had even started working on a new concept. It wasn't work-life balance anymore. The new tag word was work-life integration. How is it that I'm integrating all parts of my life, not just balancing them, because that wasn't working so well. And then right about March 13th, at least for me, it all unraveled, and it was just a whole bunch of stuff on top of each other. And that was true for parents, children, grandparents, all of us kind of having to reshuffle, how do we see the world? And it's not like we haven't been through crisis before. One of the upsides of my job right now is I have not left my home office since March 16th, which means I avoid the crisis I usually get when I'm in traffic, traveling to my work. So sometimes being stuck in traffic was a crisis. This is not new that we have arguments in families, right? There was always crisis in homes. And of course, as a ministry, you know that. You have youth and family ministry, and you have women's ministry for these reasons, because you know that crisis and sin exist, and we need to be working on that all the time. So that's not new either. When we're talking about a crisis, what I want you to think about is something that's stressful and kind of has this urgency to it, but it's also not something that's around forever. Okay, it's something that comes and goes, and so you have this stressful, urgent moment about it, but it's not a lifetime type of thing. I'll give you an example, because everybody's crisis is different. This little guy, if I were to see him in my house, would create a crisis for me. I am not a fan of mice. And I'm pointing this out because I want you to realize there are moments in life where we can practice small skills on things like mice. And that later, once we're used to doing that, they will work in the bigger things like epidemics. And so even though now our big crisis is coronavirus and all the things that that's going to mean, there's been crisis all the way along. So here are some basic things to remember about crisis. One of them is that your brain is pre-programmed to look at crisis and act. So to get that feeling that says, oh man, something's happening, what do I do? Your brain is already set up to do that. Okay? And we need that. That's how God designed it. We need a fight or flight freeze response. We need to have something that does it quickly. It essentially is a mental fire alarm. It just says, hey, pay attention, something's going on. The problem with a crisis like this, remember what I said, it's urgent, stressful, it's short term. But in a crisis like this, it's happening over and over and over again. Right? If you watch the news from one day to the next, there's something different. And so sometimes what happens is we get this overwhelming sense of a crisis like the pandemic is, only because we're having little bitty crises all the way along. So that's an important thing to remember, because each one of those moments is a moment in time where you can stop and decide what to do. Each of those little crises count, just like the mouse. And you can practice all these skills on them. So what are the four responses? Basically, there's four. You can solve, right? Go ahead and fix whatever this little crisis is. You can survive it, which just means I'm going to get through it without making it worse. You can learn to accept it, which is I'm just going to take it as it is. I'm going to explain all of these in a little more detail. Number 4, you can adapt, which just means see it from a new viewpoint, create something different out of it. And those are your 4 responses. There's a 5th option, which is to not respond, which is essentially just to stay miserable, stay in the crisis itself. And sometimes we do that, or we do it for some period of time before we realize we could do one of the other 4. All right, so we're going to work through each one of those. So let's say there's something going on in your home and you're trying to figure out if it's a crisis or not, and it seems like it is. And the very first thing you want to ask yourself is, can I solve it? Is there anything I can do? So number 1, let's use my mouse example. If I have a mouse in my kitchen, is there anything I can do to solve that? Probably. And I should probably do it quickly, right? Now is a good time. Anytime there's a mouse, that's a good time to work on it. So yes, I'm going to go do something about that. I don't know what that might be. Usually it's called my husband and he'll figure it out. Okay. What do you do with a problem maybe your children are having at home? I think at the beginning of this, a lot of parents were struggling with homework or school. And there'd be all these little crises that popped up about, how are we going to do this? How are we going to make time? Do we have enough equipment to do this? We only have one laptop. So each of those little things, you could ask this question: is it something I can solve, and is now a good time to work on it? And if the answer to both of those is yes, you do that. Okay? If the answer to either one of those is no, there's nothing I could do about it, or no, now is not a good time to work on it, then we have to use one of those other three choices. An example for parents, right? Maybe you're thinking to yourself, the first week maybe of the crisis, maybe you're like me and you're wondering about your retirement account. Is there anything I can do to solve that? That overnight this money evaporated? No, there's not anything I could do about that. I mean, maybe over the course of time, but not right now. And thinking about that in 2 a.m., not a good time to work on it, right? So the answer to that, solving that, to that crisis, is not to solve it. You can't do that. So what do? You move to the next skill: survive. What does that mean? So if I have a problem that I cannot solve, continuing to think about it is going to make it worse. So survival is important. I have to stop thinking about the unsolvable thing and then do nothing to make it worse. Do anything to not make it worse. Figure out, how do I get through this without solving it, because that's not an option, but surviving it. I love an acronym. Keeps me organized. But here are a couple acronyms of things that people can do in survival tactics. Now, remember, sometimes you're already doing this with your little people. I pick on the example of church, but if you've had little people in church, you know that sometimes having them sit through church seems like a crisis. It seems stressful and urgent, but it's not forever. And you're trying to get them to get used to doing it. So you're not willing to quit. That would solve it, but not willing to do that right now. So I have to survive. And so you've probably used a bunch of these in the past. So what do? You survive by doing activities. I call them distractivities. Do distracting things that take your mind off of it. One of the things that I started doing, actually I was doing it before this, was painting. I got a paint by number for Christmas, and it's very distracting. It's very hard to do. So it takes my mind off of everything else. So if I've got some sort of problem that I can't solve, that will take my mind off of it. I go ahead and do that. Contributing means I'm just going to go do something for somebody else. Maybe you've got several children in your home and they're kind of at each other's throats. This might be a service opportunity. Can they do something for each other that would take their mind off whatever they're fighting about, whatever is under their skin, and teach them to take care of their brother or sister, right? So contributing, just doing something for someone else. There's a lot of that going on, I'm noting. I'm very pleased to see all of that. Comparison is just the idea I can look around and see gratitude. Find gratitude in this moment. What is it that I'm seeing by comparison and say it could be worse than this? Sometimes when I work with people, I'll tell them that, you are actually doing much better than you were a week ago, or you're getting better at not getting so upset or frustrated with the computer when you're doing your homework, honey. I'm so proud of you, So looking backward and saying it could be worse, and I'm grateful for what I do have. I think a lot of people are coming away with that right now, and I'm pleased about that too. Emotions, just go ahead and get a new emotion going, right? If I'm upset or worried about something, how could I get a new emotion going? You do this with kids all the time. How do you get them to clean their room? They don't want to clean their room. You sing the cleanup song or whatever it is that they do now. So you get a new emotion going, and that gets you through it. You survive it. It's fine. Pushing away is the idea that I just look at it and I go through that question again. Can I solve it, and is now a good time? And if the answer is no, I put it on a little mental shelf behind me. I can't do anything about it right now. So I have to keep shoving it on the shelf until the answers to those questions are yes. Yes, I can do something about it, and now's a good time. So a lot of times we're going to help kids do that. There's a lot of things that they are disappointed about right now that they can't have. Time with their friends, places they used to go, sporting events, theater. And sometimes when those thoughts enter, you can teach them this skill. Is there anything you can do about that? And is now a good time to think about it? If no, it goes on the shelf. That's just how it goes. The thought skill, you just replace one thought with another thought. Sometimes it doesn't seem this way, but you can only think one thought on purpose at a time. So if you put another thought in there, boom, the previous crisis thought will be gone, at least for that amount of time. Sometimes this is where I encourage people to have Bible verses in particular, sections of scripture, quotes, things like that that are really helpful to them. Mine, there's nothing that will happen today that together God and I can't handle. And I will use that thought anytime that I have a crisis pop into my head. Works like a charm, at least for a little while. Sensations, the idea here is you're just going to go ahead and distract yourself with some sort of physical thing. Yesterday, cold rain would have worked. If I'm in a crisis and I just need to distract, that is a way to do that. 3/4 of the year, we can just stick our head outside in Wisconsin, and that'll distract us so we can survive that crisis. Then on the other side, we have the improved skills, or the skills you can do mostly in your head. So I could get my mind off of this crisis just by imagining I'm somewhere else. Maybe I'm at the beach. Your kids could imagine. Sometimes I'll teach this to teenagers. They get nervous about speeches. So I'll help them imagine that they're doing well. They imagine that it's going well. Something like that. Meaning, for meaning, is the skill of looking around and seeing what's in this. What is it that this crisis has brought that is meaningful? Right? As Christians, we're set up with a little bit more understanding of how powerful meaning can be. If I'm looking at the difficulties in my life and I have a God that I know designs my life exactly how it's supposed to be, this is a little bit easier. So looking for meaning is very, very powerful. Prayer is actually listed here as a skill. I think the person who developed these skills at best might be considered an agnostic, but still included prayer as a skill in getting through difficulty. Not only that, it takes our mind to where it needs to be, not on the problem and not on us, but on a God who can and does answer prayer. Relaxation here, maybe it's just breathing, right? I'm going to use my body just to help me relax in a crisis. There's a lot of different breathing exercises that can be done. I teach it in 4s. You just breathe in for 4, hold for 4, exhale for 4, wait for 4. Do it again. Even teach kids to do it, making a little square, and you can do it with them. But if your breathing is regulated, hopefully the crisis will go better. The one thing at a time skill, this is a way to get it down to just now. One of the things that we see a lot, especially now, is people looking forwards and backwards during a crisis rather than just staying with the crisis itself. What do I mean by that? You'll notice that for those who are very anxious, it's very much forward concern. Like, I'm really worried about what this is going to do for next school year, or my job in the future, or my 401k, right? A lot of things that are out there in front of them. Or they're going backwards and they're kind of saying, I don't know if this is ever going to get better. Remember how bad it was back on March 12th? Like, it doesn't seem, that it's going much better. And that's okay. You want to be making good informed decisions, but when you're surviving crisis, that doesn't help. It just takes the difficulty and magnifies it. So you try and stay in just the one thing at a time. This is why when we talk with people, we process through how they feel about something, because it gives them the opportunity to stay with that difficulty and do okay. If I'm doing okay with that, then I can probably let go of the things in the future and in the past that I'm worried about. Vacation is a skill. You can just kind of take a mental break. I'm just going to go around the block, or I'm going to take my lemonade and chips and go outside for 15 minutes. A little vacation from whatever it is that's happening. This is just the old distraction skill, right? We take the kids when they're in the middle of being upset with something and we distract them with something else. Go take a break outside with your brother. All right. And then encouragement. This one I'm seeing a lot between parents and older children, especially. We'll talk about it again, but with students in high school, especially those who are graduating or getting jobs, to really try and get them to be their own encouragers. But if they can't, you can do that for them. This is a great time to be practicing the encouragement skill. Third thing you can do in a crisis is accept it. I call this the Shawshank Redemption skill. If you've seen the movie, you maybe understand what I'm talking about. If you haven't, I may give it away. So, but essentially what the idea of the skill is to understand that difficulties don't change whether I accept them or not. But if I do accept them, it may go better for me. So I'm going to look at whatever this crisis or difficulty is, and I'm going to get myself to understand that it is what it is. It isn't any different than it is. It's exactly how it's supposed to be. It is caused, again, from a Christian viewpoint, we would say God put it there. And third, I still live a worthwhile life no matter what. And this thing that is here is something that I will overcome. In some way, life is still worth living. So what are the types of things that people are trying to accept right now? Well, at the very, probably most grave, right? We're trying to accept that there are sick people and there are people who have died. It doesn't help to dismiss that, you know, even when it's hurtful. We'll talk about that when we talk about grief in a minute. But acceptance is the idea that it is what it is, and I need to get on board with what it is, because then I can do things. You've probably seen this in the first maybe week or two. A lot of people were just sort of reeling, like trying to figure out, what is this? Is this really happening? This can't really happen. How did it even get here? How are we going to do things? And then you notice that they stop asking some of those questions. The why questions start to go down, all of that. And so acceptance is sometimes a process, but if you can get these three sorts of ideas going, you're probably going to feel a lot better, right? Because once you accept it, it kind of lets go a little bit. And then you can move and you can think and you can do new things. So acceptance in the Shawshank Redemption way is, I'm going to move from not really buying into what's happening to being all the way in and building a life worthwhile anyway. In the movie, Tim Robbins is in jail for killing his wife and he didn't do it. And he's in jail for life and there's nothing he can do. And we see him sort of move from non-acceptance. Like, this isn't happening. I'm not going to pretend like I'm even here. I'm just going to check out. I'm not going to make friends. I'm not going to do anything. And he moves through this whole cycle eventually to the end where you do know that he's accepted it to a certain extent, such that when reality changes, he can solve the problem. Okay. And meanwhile, he's working on acceptance. Okay. Fourth thing we can do is adapt, which is just move to a new position or a different viewpoint. I love this. This came out fairly early on, this little graphic from the University of Colorado Boulder, about where are people parked in terms of how they're viewing themselves in this pandemic. So kind of breaking it into three zones, saying here I am kind of in the fear zone, here I'm sort of in the learning zone, and then on the right, I'm in the growth zone, which basically is I've accepted and now I'm willing to build a new reality. I'm willing to adapt and do something new. Whereas on the fear zone, right, what was weekend number one? Hoard the toilet paper. I still don't know why it was toilet paper, but it was all fear driven. Right? And then people started to move a little bit to the right. So looking at this, you might be able to help your children or even yourselves kind of think about, hey, where do I actually want to be? Because it's really uncomfortable to live in that fear zone in crisis. It's really a lot better if you can get learning or growth going. Because remember, some of this isn't changing. It's not like it's going to change and that's going to make me a new person or a new way of looking at it. I can change and adapt to what's going on. That's much easier and much more likely to work. All right, so those were our 4 sets of responses to crisis. Now we're going to move to that second point that I said at the beginning. What are people doing about emotions? So I'm assuming in your homes, there's a range of emotions happening. And what's interesting is a lot of people that I talk to don't know why that is. You might be okay one moment, or your teenager might be, and then the next moment, they're just breaking down. They're frustrated, they're angry, school is stupid, whatever it is that's going through their heads. And sometimes they don't even know why. And hopefully this will help a little bit. Essentially what I want you to remember is events cause emotions. So emotions pop up in relation to things that are going on. Sometimes we know what that event is and sometimes we don't. But the emotions pop up anyway. And emotions want you to do something. They have an action associated with them. So if I walk into a bank and there's a guy who walks in with a gun and a face mask on, my emotion is fear. So I hit the ground. That's what I do. So emotions are not terrible. They're actually quite useful. But they almost always have an association with an action. So we know that that's how it works. The problem is those actions sometimes make things worse. So let's say you have a young person who is frustrated because prom was canceled. So the event is prom is canceled and the emotion is probably sadness, right? And the action of sadness for most people is crying or withdrawing, right? They don't necessarily want to feel sad. So they'll go isolate in their room or they won't talk to people. Maybe they'll cry. Maybe they'll listen to their sad song that they were going to dance to with the boyfriend and now they can't. And so they start doing these actions propelled by sadness that actually make the sadness bigger. And that's kind of the last thing you want, is to let those actions dictate the emotions. So the idea of this skill is to remember that the emotions and the events don't change. It's very hard to change sadness when your prom is canceled. That's not something easy to do. But what you can do is you can question that action and you can say, hey, is this justified? Is the level of sadness I have justified, or is the sadness justified at all? And the answer might be yes. Yes, you are justified in being sad that your prom is canceled. I get that. But do I want to reduce that? Do I want to be this sad? And if the answer is no, I don't want to be this sad. Or if at some point you've been in that loop for a while and you say, okay, wait a second, I got to get out of this. The easiest way to do that is not to change the emotion on its own, but to change the action that you're doing. So if you're sad and you've been doing things that make you more sad, go the other direction. Find things that don't make you more sad. Go for a walk, call a friend, play a different song than the sad song, right? So what you should notice is if you keep doing that opposite action, that emotion will get smaller, right? If I don't allow the teenager to sit and sulk in her room, if I get her going out for a walk, even if I just shoot baskets with her outside, the emotion will go down just because of that action, okay? So the idea is when you see an emotion, and you can model this in front of the kids, right? Because this is probably happening to you too. That I get more irritated maybe at my spouse because we're around each other all the time. I can be kind. I can submit out of reverence for Christ, not even if I feel like it. Maybe I don't feel like it, probably not. But out of opposite action, I can do that, and that emotion will go down. Kind of a miracle. So remember that you can model it for them, and you can also, participate in those opposite actions to get those emotions to go down. Okay, and then the last or the third major point that I think we're seeing that I think is worth discussing is what are the grief process tasks that people go through. So you've probably heard of maybe the grief cycle before, or kind of just that process of grief. Here's another acronym, keeps me organized. But what are the tasks or the things that people actually have to do in order to get through grief, whatever kind of grief that is? And as I said at the beginning, there is grief all over the place. And I know you know this, whether it's in your children or yourself. There's a lot of things that are kind of been taken away, that are losses right now. I remember the first week we had all the parades, the teachers would come by and they missed their kids and they had signs out, we miss you guys, and you'd see chalk on the sidewalk. And then after a while, it got a little quieter. And I think we realized this was not a novel thing. This was truly sad, right? There's little grief things like that all over the place. So thinking about what are my children going through? What am I going through? What is the other person going through? It's good to kind of identify there's probably grief in there somewhere. So what do they have to do in order to get through it? Number one, to truly accept that the event has occurred. So we just talked about that under acceptance, how to do that. And to really, get a handle on what does it mean that this happened. This is the example, for now that I'm using with seniors in high school. You're starting to see them go through this process where they really now know, okay, this is not going to happen the way it usually does. And it's a grief thing for them, right? So they have to really accept that that's happened. Some of them still struggle to do that. They're angry about it. They think it's unfair. Right? But accepting is got to happen. So truly accept it. Number 2, experience the pain of that. That's why we have funerals sometimes. It's partially that experiencing the pain is really part of that task. We have to go through that. It's part of the human experience, is experiencing the pain of the loss. That helps us process the gravity, right, or the impact that this has had. So dismissing that doesn't help. You actually have to experience that. Adjust to the new environment. Okay, so now I'm looking around. I know this has really happened. I understand the extent of it. How do I adjust to make this move forward? And maybe that is, okay, we could do like a different type of graduation ceremony, or we could have, just something we do virtually, or we could, and all of a sudden you start to see new ideas. And then reinvest. Like now they're in. Like I'm all excited about it. I get to do this car parade with my friends and make signs. And we never got to have signs at graduation before, and it becomes something new and better, different at least, than what they had lost. So across the, each of these spans, we're seeing it. I had a teacher the other day I was working with, and I thought it was very sweet. She was very sad because Mother's Day was coming. And I don't think she was being conceited about it, but she knows that the moms get the same gift from the first graders every year, and they love it. It's one of those handprints, that you make a stepping stone and you put it in your garden. And she's always the teacher who does that. And she was sad because they weren't going to be able to do that this year. Grief process, right? Something that is a loss. And there's millions of them, and all of us are experiencing them in different ways. So just to sort of recap, I think, we have a lot of things we can do in response to crisis. We talked about all 4 of those things: solve, survive, accept, and adapt. Each of the people who are experiencing COVID are experiencing it differently. What is the crisis they have? Might not be the same as yours. So be asking the children about that. Over at Christian Family Solutions, if you want to reach out to us, we have a really neat set of questions that you can ask children to expand on. What is it that they're experiencing? What's the crisis they're experiencing? Neat way to walk them through it. You can always ask for that. Emotion regulation. How do we get people to identify what they could do differently? We can't always identify what's causing this emotion problem, and we can't always figure out how to change the emotion, but we can work on that action. That's the part we could change and see if that emotion can be managed better. And then the third part was the grief process, understanding that in the middle of crisis, and especially now, there's a lot of people going through different types of grief we haven't all seen before. We think back to kind of large things that have happened, at least in my lifetime, and 9/11 springs to mind. But even that was not all sorts of individual losses. That was kind of, some people had individual losses, and the rest, like me, who didn't have an individual loss, we had kind of this fear, but we didn't have our own individual losses. So the grief process here is much, much different, because there's almost everyone is losing something of importance and is going through that grief. So again, looking at the lens of what God would have us do, I want you to be remembering, and I'm thankful for you that you would spend some time on this and thinking about, how can I help others? How can I submit to my family, my children, figure out what can I do for them out of love for God, who's got all of this in his control.